Hello, everybody. Hello. How are you? I hope that you're all doing all right. Well, if you're catching on the restream, maybe go ahead about 5 minutes and our study will start, or you can stick around for some housekeeping items. Sorry, I was about a minute late. I do apologize for that. Getting some things ready. I'll be honest, tonight it was a little difficult getting all the stuff ready. Um, yeah, I couldn't get the mic to work and the lights and some other things, and anyway, so it was a little tricky getting everything together. But we're here. We're on. So we're okay. If you're here, let me know, and let me know what you guys are up to. You can drop that in the chat. Whatever, if you're here. I do see a couple of you are here. Welcome. Glad you're here. Let's see. Let's see here. Sorry, there's one other thing I'm trying to get done here, and I can't seem to do it. Oh, man. Okay, well, let's try this then. Yep, we'll do that. What did I just do? Delete. Okay. Let's see if we got this going here. We got it working. All right. Sorry. A lot of things going on in the background. I think we got it. Sorry if there's a little extra noise tonight. The mic that I'm using is a little extra sensitive, and I put the garage door up a little bit. And so we still have some ambient noise coming from outside. Let me know if it's distracting. I can close it. No big deal. So a couple things we did want to talk about. First of all, if you are in chat, let me know on the sound if we're okay, if you can hear me. I was having a lot of mic and sound issues before, so let me know if you can hear. So we are not going to have Bible study next week, just to let you know. So we will not have Ash Tuesdays. Tuesday will still happen after Monday, just as regularly scheduled, but we won't have Ash Tuesday. Allie and I will be with the student ministries up camping, so it should be a lot of fun, but we will not be here. So next week we will not have anything. We have been talking a little bit about what it will look like for this group to start meeting again. And so I'd like to initiate that conversation in the messages in the chat. So if you guys I want to know your guys' thoughts. I don't want to lead the witness, but go ahead and initiate that, and we'll have some of that conversation, or we'll initiate it. But I just want to have the conversation as a group to see where we're at, how we're feeling, what it looks like for you guys, as far as social distancing stuff, whatever. So we want to have some of those conversations just to kind of see where we are with that. So there you go. Another question, Aaron, I'm so glad you're here. I really am. And love to see you too. When we come back, we will be firmly in the middle of official Ash Tuesdays. So we will be outside thinking about the first time we do meet, maybe having some foods. Yeah, maybe do a dinner. Outside like we normally do, but we'll be barbecue. So maybe we'll do it up. So yeah, that's some of our thoughts. But hey, I'm glad that you are wanting to meet soon. I mean, we've been missing you guys, missing our meetings. So anyway, tonight, so yeah, we'll have that conversation. We'll do it in the message, in the iMessage, your phone messages, whatever, the chat conversation we have there. So we'll be talking about that tonight. Tonight, we will be continuing to have our conversation concerning race and some issues around there. A few weeks ago, if you haven't been watching, this is the third one that we've done concerning some issues. There's so many things that have been happening for a while. I feel as though there's a need for some discernment, some time for us to talk. And by talk, I mean I will talk at my computer, and you guys will listen somewhere, wherever you are. But there's conversations that need to happen, and I know that some of those conversations have been happening one-on-one. As a group, I want to make sure that we're talking about some of these things. I see the Youngs. I should say Mr. Young and future Mrs. Young are in the chat. That's great. I want to, I've always wanted this group to be a place where anyone could ask any question. We could have any kind of conversation. There's nothing that's really off topic. I mean, if you've been going to Ash Tuesdays for a while, you know that we will get into really anything. We will have whatever conversation we need to have. We've had some weird ones. I say weird, not to say that they're not important, just weird meaning they're not conversations that come up all the time. We talked about, go way back. We've talked about a lot of different things. And this is one of those things. We should be free to talk about this. And I should say, actually, there are some people that say that we shouldn't be having so many conversations about this in this way. But I'd say that any conversations that you can have are good ones. Any of these topical sort of things we can have, they'd be good. And we want to bring it back to Scripture and bring Scripture into it as much as we can. So hopefully that's something that we can do. So tonight is kind of it's an oddball of the discussions that we're having. There's so many conversations that are happening right now. And there's some conversation I'd like to have right now, but I feel like there needs to be a little bit of time for those particular ones. But I think one that will help us to frame some thoughts and conversations around this is tonight we're going to have a reframing and a reorientation kind of a conversation. It kind of a resetting of the table so we can continue to have good conversations concerning race, concerning could say oppression, you could say just in general, humans interacting with humans kind of stuff. We're going to be talking about those things. We're reframing the conversation. And the reason I state it that way, it's too difficult to allow others to determine how the conversations happen and what conversations happen. And I would say that what's happening right now feels like something that is a massive upheaval for some people. Sometimes it feels like it's a huge reorientation. But I'll say this, it's not something that was unexpected, and it's not something that that we can't talk about. So I want to talk about it in a little bit different way tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about what I would say is the capital S system, the system. And I think the church is uniquely positioned to have this part of the conversation. I think that, like we talked about last time, reframing the conversation to be not racial. I really don't think race is the actual keystone issue. I do think race is a modern construct. I think race, and see, every time if I start to have the conversation, there are a lot of people who will immediately stop and say, "No, but what about? No, but what about?" And I want to just say, let's have a little bit of time. Let me lay some things out, and you can see where I'm coming from. And I think I'll probably have to start with things that I'm not saying when we talk about that part. But before we go any further, I do want to ask the Lord to bless our time. Father, Lord, as we look into your word and we have poignant conversation, Lord, about real things, real issues, things that matter to you, Lord, I pray that we would be continually yielding to you. We would be willing to have our minds, Lord, changed, our wills changed, our hearts changed based on your word. I pray, Lord, that we would not find new ways to divide, but instead find ways, Lord, to be united. And I pray that we would do these things to your glory and to honor you, recognizing that you are our creator, recognizing that you don't make mistakes, and recognizing that you, Lord, have a hope and a plan for human beings and that we are moving towards. And so, Lord, I pray that we'd be able to have a conversation, even a difficult one, and still come out of the conversation encouraged. Lord, I pray that my words and my thoughts that I would like to put forward would fall to the ground, but that what you would have us to discuss and the areas that we would lean, Lord, would be, Lord, pleasing to you and be the correct ones for us to have. Lord, thank you. And pray you'd lead us tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So as we begin, I want to say a few things that I'm not saying, things I'm not discussing. As we have the conversations we're having tonight, the first thing is that it really is kind of dependent on having an understanding of what we talked about last time, which is the idea that race is a construct brought about by Darwinian evolution. It's not a construct that has existed with humans in that manner until then. It was based on, first, by observation with Darwinism, and then as it led into this later expressions of science eased into genetics, and that became the logical conclusion as far as science goes to move that direction. But that's the direction that society took. And honestly, you could do a master course on following that line of reasoning from the Enlightenment all the way through to modern day. But those sort of constructs are there. When I say that there's no such thing as race, what I'm not saying is that there are not, I was going to say disagreements, and that's not what I was looking for, that there aren't divisions among people that have been brought about through understanding the world through that lens. And I'm not saying that there isn't difficulty. What I'm trying to say is we do have divisions among people, but some of those divisions are not based on the fact that you have one group of people that's distinct from another group of people. And I think that's the problem that with having the conversation the way that we have it, is that we make it an issue concerning the divisions of humanity along lines of genetics, rather than divisions within humanity as we actually live them out. I say that because I don't think that most people who would say that there are races and that there's distinctions between races and that there are racist tendencies throughout all that, I think that they're putting the emphasis in the wrong place, and I think they don't live consistently with that either. It would be my point if we were, if this was a paper I was writing, I would say my main conjecture would be that most of the issues that are taking place in the United States are due to a unrealized caste system more than they are according to lines of race. And I say that because we can find lots of examples where racial issues don't exist for certain segments of certain races. They just disappear. So even though everyone would say, the society or culture would say it is a certain way, we live it out a different way. And some of that you can get through statistics and some other things. I'm going to go a different route. We're going to get there from a completely different angle. We're going to arrive there though. So I just gave you the end. That's where we're going to arrive. But hopefully we'll arrive there with some more understanding. So it actually starts in the beginning, and it starts with creation. It starts with God creating a world with certain criteria and certain duties and certain things that are laid out. I do take the creation account seriously. I don't see any reason to not. The rest of Scripture takes it seriously. Jesus affirms and confirms the creation account. So if you have a problem with that, you have a problem with how Jesus taught and thought and how he constructed his own arguments in some cases, because the discussions that happen are in that construct. So that is the point of view that I'm taking, and I take that because I take God's word seriously. I take God's word seriously because it is a communicated revelation that came outside of our time-space continuum. The word came from someone outside of our own situation who can see the situation, and it happens to be the same one who created this world. And so we simply have an account that was handed down to us and given to us to say, this is how it happened. So anyway, I probably didn't have to go into that part, but I did anyway. And you're welcome. So God created the world, and certain things are true. And I'd love to really hold on to some of those things. God created the world good. The world was good. God also created the world or to support kinds. One of the ways that's shown throughout the creation account was the different days that God created. So one day we've got birds and fish. Those are two different kinds. One day, then you have land animals. You have humans. You have these distinct times where things are created, and that's on purpose. And we have those kinds spoken of throughout Scripture: birds, beasts. In fact, when you get to Revelation, you have the living creatures before the throne. Revelation chapter 4. And other places in Revelation, but they're first introduced in chapter 4. You have the four living creatures, and what are they? You've got someone with the face of a man, right? One kind, an eagle, so you have a bird. You've got a beast. You've got someone with an ox, right? So you've got these different kinds represented there. No fish, though. No fish in heaven, apparently. It is hard for them, I guess, to flop around on the throne room. But anyway, the idea and the concept is that there's a distinction between kinds. The one group where there's no distinction between any kinds is humans, right? We are all one kind. And when man was created, there was a purpose, and the purpose was for man to image God, represent God, to be the image of God, to show authority and dominion on earth. to do it in a loving way, responsible way, a caring way, in a way that a gardener would tend a garden. And that was the first job that humans had, to tend the garden. All right. So you have these constructs that are built. You have the construct of marriage put in place. You have the idea of multiplication of humans, right? It is good for humans to have children. So you have these different things that are set down for humans. One of those was to enjoy the earth, to live in unity. The first time we see disunity, this is actually at the point of sin, at the fall. But where you see it again is between brothers. There's conflict. Cain and Abel have a conflict. It ends in murder, that's, I think, the worst outcome for a conflict. It's to have murder, for a life to end. But it starts there. That is where we have problems. We have problems between humans, and it's a problem between brothers. In that case, it was jealousy. Fill in the blank. You have imagers who are made to rule, and they are in conflict with other imagers who are led to rule. So in sinfulness, ruling beings who have dominion bump heads, and so they will seek to dominate each other. That's the problem. That is the problem from the end. So, or from the beginning, it'll be the problem until the end. And so that's where we actually get to the system. So the system is conflict between two imagers of God who are made for dominion, to rule over things, that end up ruling each other, which means that right from there, the most basic way to talk about this, you have one human who lives in dominion over another. And right there you have a type of hierarchy. You have a hierarchy that is in its most simple form, one human over another human. We overcomplicate it, we change it, we do whatever, but that's where it goes. And once you have other systems in place, civil government wasn't established by God until after Noah. Before that, it was the family system. So you have families, you end up with tribes from families, you end up with a governmental system when God tells Noah that if a human kills another human, because they have destroyed the image of God, that human must then pay with their own life. That is capital punishment. It's one of the principles that has existed for the longest time. It is what has kept civil society. It was what the first really big conflict between humans ended in. And so it was something that God instituted to actually prevent the ruining of God's image in humans. And it's important to have this kind of conversation. So every single individual, every single human being is distinct from animal and is in the image of God. And it's so important for us to solidify that in our hearts and our minds, because it is the starting point for us when we start to have some of these more detailed conversations. When you have civil government established, you have the one problem with civil government is that it is propagated by humans. And so as you have civil government, you have sinful humans. Sinful humans find ways of dominating each other in organized ways. And so rather than it providing protection from those who are doing good, it becomes an oppression to other human beings. And it's to that same basic problem where humans dominating other humans in a sinful manner. And I say in a sinful manner because it's other humans can rule over other humans in a kind way, in a way that is appropriate, in a way that is helpful. And we see that structure established in the family. Technically, parents rule over children, and grandparents rule over, their children who rule over other children. And that seems like a kind of a distinct hierarchy, but what you end up with is a really well laid out structure for a grouping of people. It's the most common expression of ruling in all the world. In every single culture, we have it. And so it's not on accident. When you have humans dominating other humans, that's the other thing we have. So we have creativity. We find creative ways to do it. Bigger structures, more complex structures, even structures to where sinfulness, error, improper living becomes institutionalized to the point where it we actually call evil things good and good things evil, which is it's one of the descriptions of how the world becomes. Even closer do we get to the end, it gets even worse. So, all that to say, it leads us, I want to then jump forward a little bit to Jesus. Jesus talked to his followers, and he makes this statement, and I've heard this statement many times, quoted in lots of different ways. But Jesus says to his followers in the Gospel of Luke, "The poor you will always be with you." And I've heard that phrase ripped out of that verse and used for a lot of different things. And one thing it's used for is to sort of build this very weird argument. The poor will always be with us. And so some people then take that to mean that, there's just no point in really trying to make a big difference because the poor will always be with us. There was it wasn't a study, but there was somebody who did some sort of calculation based on human behavior to say that if we actually gave everyone we'll keep it in the United States to make it easier. If we gave everyone, took the whole GDP, we took all the money that's in the United States right now, and we divided it up evenly to everyone. So let's say that everybody in the United States was given, to keep it easy, and given $2 million. They said that within the end of, or by the end of the following month, the people who are rich now would be rich again. The people who are poor would be poor again. They say because how people live and if they're rich or poor is through behavior. It's not a status thing necessarily. Now we know that there are some exceptions to that. You'd have somebody who, if we give $2 million to, let's say, to one of my children, let's say we gave $2 million to my daughter, Leah. She would not use it well. She would waste it, right? Or she wouldn't really know what she had, and she wouldn't really use it properly until she figured out what she had. And then, I mean, it's to think of it that way, to say like, oh yeah, that would be $2 million wasted, right? She would become poor because she was ignorant of how things really worked. And I know that's an extreme case, and why would you give $2 million to a 5-year-old? But what happens is you have people who are rich and you have people who are poor. It goes to the same construct. You have people who dominate other people, but sometimes it's through learned behavior. Sometimes it's through ignorance that people become poor. But a lot of times sometimes it's just situational, right? The point that Jesus was making there was not really anything to have to do with that. You look at the whole context, what Jesus is saying is, that's a woman comes and uses some very, very, very expensive perfume to anoint Jesus' feet. Very expensive, very costly. And Judas says, hey, we could have sold that and given it to the poor. What Jesus is doing is calling his bluff. He doesn't want to give to the poor. He wants to take some of the money. He's saying that's a big waste. We could have given it to the poor. The poor becomes this reason to liquidate something valuable to then redistribute, and he'll get his own cut, right? He'll reach his hand in, he'll take from it. Actually talks about how Judas was stealing out of the money bag. You're probably wondering, where in the world are we going? I want to look at a couple verses, because I think sometimes when we see passages like that, and we hear some of these stories, and we've now kind of set the table a little bit, we can say, what in the world is God thinking when he has a world put together where you can have such extreme wealth and extreme poverty existing almost simultaneously in the same space? When I was stayed in India for a while, one thing we did, we went to this really big mall. It's funny, it was actually two massive mall. I mean, we're talking 4 or 5 stories, and these two malls were on both sides of the street, had this massive walkway. It was crazy. And you'd have people driving up to get into the mall parking, and they're the richest of the rich, richer than anyone you've ever met, with the ritziest cars you could think of, very expensive clothes and jewelry and all the stuff, right? Extremely rich people. And as they drive up, they pass by the poorest of the poor people, people who have never even owned their own set of clothes before, that they haven't just scrounged around and found, right? So, I mean, literally someone dying in the street, and you have this other person driving up. How can you have this kind of thing? What is God thinking? What is he doing? And I want to kind of set the record straight a little bit. So I want to look at a couple of verses. We're not going to look at a ton. I have some extras. So this is Job chapter 29, and Job is one of the older books in the Bible. It predates Genesis as far as its writing. Most likely, it's based on textual comparison and linguistics, right? Same way, it's like an older Hebrew, like we have English now, and we have like Old English. This is kind of a similar thing. They say, oh, this must be much older. Let's look at this. Let's look at what God says about this in the book of Job here. So look at verse 11. As soon as the ear heard these things, it blessed me. And when the eye saw them, it bore witness to me. For I rescued the poor who cried out for help. This is Job talking. I rescued the poor who cried out for help, and the orphan who had no one to assist him. The blessing of the dying man descended on me, and I made the widow's heart rejoice. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My just dealing was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes for the blind, feet for the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I investigated the case of the person I did not know. I broke the fangs of the wicked and made him drop his prey from his teeth. That's a very interesting kind of poetic statement here. But basically what you have is a list of different instances where Job says, I cared for those who were needy. Right? I rescued the poor when he cried out, the orphan, the widow, the blind, the lame, father to the needy. Job says he did all of these things, and what he's stating is these are actions that display righteousness. So even in the earliest book of the Bible written, Job proves, or attempts to prove his righteous state by stating these are the actions of a righteous man. To do these things. One of the things to remember in all of these examples, it's a little different than it is today. These were all people who would be seen as essentially liabilities. And I say that meaning these were people who would never be able to pay you back. You gave something to an orphan, you'd never expect an orphan to be able to pay you back in any kind of meaningful way. Same with a widow. Same with the fatherless. And we say the fatherless, a big part of that is not having an inheritance. Okay, they're essentially orphaned in that sense. They don't have anything to be able to pay you back. we see that Job cared for them. He uses that as a proof of his own righteousness. Job 31, verse 16. Sorry, don't mean to make you seasick. Verse 16, I have refused to give the poor. I'm sorry, if I have refused to give the poor what they desired, or caused the eyes of the widow to fail, if I ate my morsel of bread myself and did not share any with orphans, but from my youth raised an orphan like a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone about to perish for lack of clothing, or a poor man without a coat, whose heart did not bless me as he warms himself with the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand to vote against the orphan when I saw my support in court, then let my arm fall off from my shoulder and my arm be broken off at the socket. Basically saying, if you can find any other, like this, he basically curses himself. He said, if you can find any instance where I haven't done these things, if I have not been an advocate for the poor, then I don't deserve to have my arms. My arms should leave my body. Again, all of these instances are people that are in dire need, continual need, and a few different things, right? This was the one that always kind of struck me. If I ate my morsel of bread myself and did not share any with the orphans, if I ate by myself and I didn't share my food, I mean, even down to the simple case of just not caring when he ate a meal. And he's saying that I don't deserve just the normal blessings that I have. What this does is this tells us that even at this early time, there was an understanding that caring for the poor was not, it wasn't a negotiable element for someone who's deemed themselves righteous. Leviticus 19, we don't have time to go into it. There are provisions in the law for the poor, saying if you own all these lands, leave things in your field for the poor, for them to glean, so people can come back and they can gather up. Leave something for the poor. All right, and notice what it says: you must leave them for the poor and the resident foreigner. The resident foreigner, someone who was foreign, didn't have ancestral lands, didn't have an inheritance that was necessarily coming to them if they were living in Israel this way. If they were, some say, see, an immigrant, and it's like, yeah, it's an immigrant, but I challenge you not to put a modern spin on it. This is someone who's an outsider. It says, and you could say like, oh, this is an oppressive stance because it's saying anyone from the outside needs to beg and needs to take food from the ground. And yeah, that's kind of the case. That's kind of the situation they were in. If they were the foreigner who was resident there, like I said, they wouldn't have necessarily land to grow their own food or the means to be able to purchase food. And so what God is saying here is you need to care for them. You need to provide for them. And in fact, you need to operate as though you know that there are people in need and that you are preparing for that. You actually intentionally prepare for that. Deuteronomy 14 is another one. Verse 28 and 29. At the end of every 3 years, you must bring all the tithe of your produce in that year, and you must store it up in your villages. Then the Levites, because they don't have an allotment of land or inheritance with you, the resident foreigners, the orphans, the widows of your villages may come and eat their fill, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work that you do. This is a small part of this conversation about tithes. A lot of times you think, oh, tithe 10% and give it, I'm done. That's not what a tithe was. I mean, it was 10%, but the idea that you give 10% and you're done, that wasn't the case. This is one of the tithes that was discussed. This is the tithe for the poor. So everyone who was able to should be, says, save this up and to give it intentionally, on purpose. One that's interesting is Ezekiel 16, verse 49. So this is the prophet Ezekiel prophesying against Judah. He says, "See here, it was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had majesty, abundance of food." No, first of all, okay, Sodom. We say like Sodom and Gomorrah are examples of super rebellious, terrible groups, right? The cities, they represent that group of just total lawless sinfulness. And look at what is stated here. It says, "She and her daughters had majesty, abundance of food, and joy, carefree ease, but they did not help the poor and the needy. They were haughty and practiced abominable deeds before me. Therefore, I sought to remove them." Now, is this the first thing that you would put on the list, knowing what we know about Sodom? Their immorality is one thing, but God put this thing first. They had an abundance and they didn't share with anyone. They didn't take care of the needy or the poor. Psalm 82 is another one. This is it's a big conversation if you haven't studied through these verses with us before. God stands in the assembly of the gods, and he renders judgment. He says, "How long will you make unjust legal decisions and show favoritism to the wicked?" But look at verse 3. "Defend the cause of the poor and the fatherless. Vindicate the oppressed and suffering. Rescue the poor and the needy. Deliver them from the power of the wicked." All of these things are things that God says these are what righteous people do. You want to know if someone's righteous? Look and see if they do these things. If they care for those who are in need, that is an indicator that they are righteous, that they are doing what they're supposed to do. All right? Now, I say all that because that is the construct we need to have. We have the same discussions, right? We went to the Gospels. In James, it talks about pure and undefiled religion. James 1:27 is caring for the orphan and the widow, the exact same thing that we've been talking about before. So where does this take us? This is an aspect of the conversation that's happening right now that is not necessarily named. It's not brought up there in the forefront. This is actually, I think, the main issue that we have. And I'll say this for different reasons. And I'm going to kind of rattle off a lot of the stuff. Our time is moving on, but I feel like we set the table to see like God's intended understanding of righteousness includes caring for those who can't care for themselves, caring for the needy, providing for them, and providing for them whether you receive anything or not. Right? And there's a whole list. Those who have physical ailments, right? The blind and the lame, as we saw in Job. Those who have socioeconomic situations like orphans and widows. Those who are have a status that essentially leaves them out, like the fatherless. All right? All of these groups, it is God's intention for righteous people to care for them. All right? That we can rest on that principle. What is currently happening now, I think, has more to do with the socioeconomic situation in the United States than it does a racial issue in the United States. And I'm not saying that there isn't some other divisions and things, but I think one of the more basic thing that's being propagated is this concept. It's the oppressed, the poor, the disadvantaged, if you want to use a more modern term. I think this is actually one of the bigger issues that is brought up here. I'll get rid of this here. That comes up when you're having these conversations. And I say this when we had a lot of the demonstrations. So you have to say in all the categories, the demonstrations, the protests, the rioting, all of those different groupings. They're not all the same people, right? There were people who were flat out rioting. There were people who were the provocateurs, who were the tempters. You have people who were protesting, and you had people who were demonstrating. And these are all different groups that are all mixed up, doing different things at the same time. And that's a whole other conversation about what in the world is going on there. But what you have is, if you went out to one of these things, and maybe some of you did, and you look at the composition, people might be chanting Black Lives Matter, but very few of them were Black. And in this city, in this county, I believe the Black population it's less than 2%. I think I heard 1.5. It's less than 2%. So less than 2% of this city's population. It's not really that many. And then of course not everybody's going to go to protest. But what ended up happening is you look and you see a lot of people who come out and stand with them. And a lot of people say, well, these are allies. These are people who are aligned with these other folks, and they're coming to show support. And I just really didn't see that when I went to see it. I'd say there are people who are chanting Black Lives Matter, but they're saying something else. They're saying the words Black Lives Matter, but in the rhetoric and the conversations that are happening out there, and when people stand and give their speeches and things, the issues they bring up, the things they talk about, are not necessarily exclusive to the Black community. They bring up things about overburden or police principles or practices, or just the police in general being overburdening or violent, or pick the whole spectrum, right? Defund police. It's that's the quick slogan. What they mean is take money away from the police because they're seen as the oppressor, and give it to needy, right? Give it to school kids, give it to someone else. Or some people just say defund them, take money away from them. There's a lot of these things that this doesn't really have a lot to do with what the issues are with the Black community. We know this because in a lot of these areas where these things were happening, when the police were tied up at these different protests and things, you saw a massive spike of crime. Some of the worst days of crime in some areas of Chicago. And I remember Chicago because statistically they had one of their worst days since the 20s. I mean, the 20s were like Al Capone kind of lawlessness. So you have these things happening, and so the conversations that are happening, they're not exclusive to the Black community. And I think I even said 3 or 4 weeks ago that the next thing that was going to happen was that the message was going to get hijacked by some other group. And it did very quickly. But there aren't very many things that are very specific to the Black community that are being discussed right now. They have more to do with what is perceived as the oppressed poor or the disadvantaged socioeconomic group. And there are many more that have been added to that group since COVID popped up on the scene. So most of this I think a lot of this conversation actually has to do with the socioeconomic issue. And that issue is not just white or rich, Black or poor, because that doesn't exist like that. That's not the construct. If you want to go pure numbers or pure percentage, there are far more poor white people in the country. I'm not saying that there aren't any Black communities that are disadvantaged, but there are lots and lots of poor people, and they come in all different shades of skin tones, lots of different shades of pasts, groupings. And I would actually more, it's not this bad, but it's more akin to India's caste system than it is a strict racial line, because you have groups that completely defy some of these other groupings that take place. So there are whole segments of society where you have um, middle class, upper little middle class minorities, and that's not to say that there aren't. That's the other thing to say. There's prejudices and there are um, biases that take place all over the place. And I'm not saying that those things don't exist, but what I'm saying is some of the major issues that take place more so have to do with socioeconomic issues than they do with just strictly racial issues. And I want to talk real quick about the terms. So the terms that are used, man, it's the wrong terms. These are the wrong things to use. And the thing is, you have to use them, otherwise no one really follows what you're saying. But even just using the words white and the words black, we don't really know what the history behind those words really are. They did not begin as racial designations. That did not have to do with it. In fact, there was a time in Europe where calling someone of the white ilk meant that they had ties to royalty or to the lords. They had ties to those families. It had to do with a family connection to an economic status or to a just general status within a community. Had more to do with who was considered white. So even amongst people who are today, we'd say all those people are white. That wasn't what it was. Slowly in the West, those two designations, as you had this great experiment in the United States, which was this removal of the structure, started to identify with pretty much anybody who was in that normal socioeconomic spot, as opposed to foreigners who came in after some of those things were established. So those things started out later. But you even get to this, I mean, that's the white aspect of that. And if you tie it back to the occult, the understanding of the word in term white in esoteric meaning doesn't have anything to do with race. It has to do with things like purity. In fact, white contains all the colors. So you could even say that, okay, kind of what proves the point. The whole idea of Aryan during World War II, the Aryan race, the thing that Hitler is famous for wanting to perfect, did not necessarily have to do with race. It had to do with the blood of the master race. What's interesting is he sent people to places like Tibet to look for the Aryans. It did not necessarily connect with skin tone, skin color, racial things like that. It had to do with a status of human being. And so the thought is in those areas near the Himalayas, there were people who were of the Aryan race, more so meaning that family of people, that group of people, that genetic line, basically where the royals originally came from, that kind of idea. But it wasn't a strict color of skin thing. However, because there were thoughts of the whiteness of someone, the next thing you compare it to would be the blackness of someone else. Throughout the 1700s, 1800s, as a juxtaposition of the category or grouping of white, which again had more to do with social economic status, you had what was called, and I don't, and I have to say this because that's the term was used, but it was colored. And today we don't like that. What's funny is the term that's used is people of color, which grammatically has no difference between that and colored people. It's grammatically exactly the same. It just hits our ear different and has a different connotation. But understand, I'm not saying it for any kind of denigrating reason, but that was the term that was used as anyone that was colored. You even have situations where you have someone talking about someone who we would say is black. They would talk about themselves being black, their parents being black, but their grandparents being colored. So even when we get into the modern use of the word black, it doesn't necessarily just mean a racial thing. There is a status attached to that as well. So the calling someone black, see, when you get to the 60s, the term black changes because they saw that the term white was being used for power. So you get to figures like Malcolm X, and he starts to talk about black being used for power. If white, remember, in the socioeconomic status kind of thing, not the racial tone, but the status thing, if white could be used that way, and of course, when we get to the 60s, it is tied up with the racial idea as well, but then black could also be used as a power statement. So they didn't want to be called colored. They wanted to be called black because black was a term used for power. And that's where you have the Black Power movement. And so then someone called black meant that they were, it was a chance to actually claim some of that power, right? So if white had power, black now has power. And so it's a very interesting thing to look at as far as terminology goes. So because personally, I have no tie to the term white. I don't. There's no connection for me. I would more so identify with a nationality, with a grouping, with my where my ancestors came from, my relatives came from. I'd more so identify with that. I don't. I mean, I'm called white, but I don't have a connection with that as far as a power connection that way. And part of that is just when we're believers, we drop a lot of those things. Those things don't have those kind of things together that mix together any longer. Malcolm X had a lot of really amazing statements to make. I don't. I mean, I'm not signing off on everything he ever said, but I'm saying he had some really amazing statements to make about the black community. One of the things, and this is something that is a very vivid thought, but he talks about black. He uses coffee as the word picture. So you have a cup of coffee, and if the coffee is strong, if you want your coffee strong, how do you order it? You order it black. And if the coffee is too strong for you, what do? Add in a little milk. You add in a little white. And that's actually how he saw integration. He saw integration as actually a way to make the black community weaker. He saw it as an opportunity for infiltration. He talks about the infiltration of white liberals. And he talks about the said he didn't trust white conservatives, but at least white conservatives would kind of let you stay separate and work alongside. but he didn't trust white liberals because he saw white liberals as people who sought to come in and to mix in, to infiltrate, to then subvert. And so he actually warned the black community against white liberals because he saw that as the big danger. Now, obviously, when you get to someone like Malcolm X, he is talking in a very racial term, and he was living in a time where it was along what we would call racial lines. But a lot of the issues that were being brought up had more so to do with socioeconomic status, education status, and some different things that were seemingly being pushed out of black communities. And I think there are things you can look and see some of those things taking place. That's what, but the problem that we have is that even in saying it, it's too black and white, one and the other. We have way oversimplified some of these conversations. Okay, so how are we going to bring it back? It comes back to this. What should we be doing? We can't get trapped in the muddled conversations that are taking place on the cultural level in a lot of different places, because it's actually a worthless conversation. Because if the issue is simply a integrative racial issue, you can't force someone to do that. It's not going to work. As far as forcing, and I say this, you can't force someone to empathize with someone else. You can't do it. Here's our responsibility as believers. We see people as people. We see people as individuals, but we need to see them in their real situation. We need to see everyone as being individuals created in the image of God, worthy of dignity, who are made to have dominion. Okay? That means things like having a family structure, having things like being educated to allow someone to rule over something. Right? There's a lot of these things that are kind of built into this, and we as believers need to look and to see that. The problem we have, the same problem we have with a lot of other things, is we see this one big massive problem. So how do we go out and fix the world? We can't fix the world. We don't have the means. We don't have the structures. We don't have the power, the institutional power. We don't have the resources. We can't do it. Jesus will return, and Jesus will rule properly. And so for us, where does it come down to? It goes back to Job. It goes back to Job, who is standing before God, who is saying, I'm a righteous man, and this is why I'm saying I'm a righteous man. I did these things. I cared for the needy. I cared for the orphan. I cared for the widow. I didn't turn my back on someone who needed food. I didn't turn my back on someone who needed clothes. I cared for them. People who were blind, people who physically were in need. I did what I could with every opportunity. I lived my life intentionally. I didn't eat my food alone. I ate my food in a way that was sharing to other people. That kind of structure. What are you going to do personally and individually to the people that you meet, to the people that you see? What are you going to do? That is a conversation worth having. And it's a conversation we should have as believers. So and there's a lot of ground to kind of come back from. There have been a lot of issues in a lot of cities in the United States where I wouldn't say that the church was maybe not, they weren't present for the most part. But you did have black churches in black communities who were in need who were doing those things. So it gives opportunity for those who are in some of those areas to love and to care for each other. So all that to say, the Lord doesn't turn his back on those who are in need. But it is easy for us to not see others in need. And I'm going to include other people in that too. Remember how I said that the U.S. is kind of structured somewhat like a caste system. I think we have another group that is even worse off. We've got people who have no place to live, who are unhoused, that we treat in this very different manner, different way. And I think it's an indicator. I think for the lowest socioeconomic rung, how we treat the poorest of the poor is evidence of how we will treat some of the others around us. In a lot of conversations, the homeless are left out, the destitute are left out of some of those conversations. We as believers need to be those who advocate in all of those places. The reason I say it this way is that we can focus so much on one particular avenue and miss the other needs. And I say that because the conversation right now, the popular conversation happening right now is concerning Black lives. So when we look around our own community, we can look in our neighborhood and go, there's no Black people living in my neighborhood here or there. You can feel good because you bought something from a Black run business online, right? And I'm not saying those things are bad. What I'm saying is that we then might miss out on the opportunities we have around us for those who don't fit in that category. If we instead pull ourselves back to say, what is our intended goal as a human being on earth, interacting with other human beings, how shall we live? When we see one human being dominating another human being, what should we do? What we see is that there's care for the needy. What we don't see is an overthrow of the oppressor. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. There's a couple of other points that we didn't get to this week. Or I keep saying next week. We're not meeting next week. Next time we meet. There are a couple of other issues with this. I feel like we're not quite finished having this conversation. We'll continue to have some of these conversations on this topic. But what we're going to talk about next time, principally, Anyway, all that to say, I've gone for a really, really long time. But I really hope that if you didn't grab anything else from tonight, hopefully you're able to see this. The conversations that are happening today are not new. They're old. Be careful not to be tied up so much in the terminology of today. Look past some of those things to see the enduring issues of righteousness that have existed from the garden onward, that we should be professionals as believers. We should be the professionals caring for anyone, the poor, the overlooked, the oppressed, the sick, the destitute. We should be professionals caring for them. And I'm saying this as somebody who's trying to figure out how I do that in my place where I'm at now. Wherever the Lord gives you opportunity, how do we live out those principles? And uplifting this idea and highlighting the idea that every single human being is of tremendous worth. Every single one. And so how do we live that consistently? And if we do that consistently, then it won't matter who we meet, but it will mean that we have the right conversations when they arise. that we don't overlook oppression, but that we don't trade oppression. There's a lot of different issues going on. And what we need to do is to make sure that those who need, we advocate for, we give to, we're kind to, we're loving to. That is our mandate, and that's what we must do. And so hopefully we can continue having that conversation. And I would say this in the next bit, before we have another Bible study like this, to think, what is it? What am I supposed to do? What are some of the things that I'm responsible for in your life? Not in a really big sense, because see, for us to, okay, I'll give to the needy, and then not to actually figure out what that is. See if there are names. Ask the Lord to bring people to your mind. Who are the needy people? Who are the people that need you in their life? Don't get lost in all of the conversation happening for the country, for the world, for the state, and miss the opportunity the Lord's giving you to not just say, I know that these things are all important, but to be able to say to the Lord, I'm doing this thing, or I'm caring for this person. These are big, big things. And I'll tell you what, it's a lot easier to have this kind of conversation when it's an actual conversation. So I'm looking forward to seeing you guys again, to meeting with you guys again. So let's have that conversation offline from here. But anyway, love you guys. Yeah, appreciate you guys sticking with it. It's one of the longer ones. But yeah, if any of this was helpful, thought-provoking, it's great. If it was mostly rambling, then forgive me. But yeah, pray the Lord be with you, and go before you. Have a great night. Goodbye.